we're going to pivot again in terms of our Warrior Gamer mindset. Now, this one I've got to read because in true Army fashion, I'm gonna rib you a little bit, Philip, in terms of sort of Army Air Force connections. But I got to read these acronyms because it's the only way that I can track it. So it's my honor to introduce, he'll be joining us on stage now, Lieutenant Colonel Phillip Thomas. And Phillip is a Special Forces officer serving as the United States Army Special Operation Command's Capability Manager for Synthetic Training Environments and Human Performance Advisor. Beyond the incorporation of synthetic training, which he's going to talk and introduce us to into organizations, the STE initiatives include integration of data systems to support human performance and adaptive learning. So it is my true honor and privilege to introduce introduce Phillip Thomas, soon to be Doctor. Phillip.
John, thanks. I'm actually finished, so I suppose I'm a doctor, but I'm not used to being referred to a doctor in either case. So thank you guys for having me on. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Pretty tough acts to follow this morning so far, or this afternoon so far. Following several doctors and some awesome gamers, rugby players, app developers. Pretty awesome. I'm glad to be here talking about it. It's a good thing, just like physical fitness, mental fitness is pretty important. I'm going to kind of jump right into some things. I'll start with saying depression and suicides, except, we focus on the training, and I think that's sometimes short-sighted. I know the Army has suicide prevention training, all these things. A lot of times it ends up being, hey, don't do suicide, or hey, dude, don't be depressed. Yeah, I wish I would have thought of that, right? So it's kind of like if we were going to, if we knew a bunch of ambushes were going to happen downrange, we wouldn't say, hey, don't get ambushed. We would actually train. We would talk about it. We would engage and look out for each other. So all that being said, I kind of came to this group based on an accidental collision. So I was in another human performance seminar. I think Josh was there, heard me speak about some things. He reached out to me. Interestingly enough, the phone call took to talk to him, JD and Kevin. I was actually coming out of a mental health clinic. I had scheduled the phone call so I would be done with my appointment. So I'll just go ahead and throw that out there. Other disclaimers before I get too far into this. The last several weeks have been pretty tough for the U.S., but for veterans particularly, pretty tough time. So I'll try to hold my stuff together. Luckily, Josh played the video from GodQ, and GodQ give us permission to drop the F-bomb. So that's pretty cool in case that does slip out. But as JD said, I'm kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. Civil engineering background, defense analysis masters with specialty in irregular warfare, and then went on for industrial organizational psychology PhD, or master's and PhD. So usually when you say psychology, people are like, whoa, you're judging me, you're talking, you're a psychologist. And I'm always really quick to let them know that I'm a industrial organizational psychologist. So I'm concerned about the organization's problems, not theirs. I have enough problems of my own to worry about. So talking to JD, I talked to him earlier in the week and kind of trying to bring everything together. What we decided on was a couple big buckets. Well, we kind of talked, but I'm going to frame it out in a few big buckets. So I'm going to try to bring in Janelle's talk, or Dr. McCauley, and the survivors talk, and the brain plasticity talk. Try to bring them all together in four main buckets. So the first is performance. Then I'm going to move on to survival, and I put that one second because I think after you survive, you normally move on to this clinical area but I'm kind of naming that struggling with. And then fourth, actions we can take. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump into some of my notes here. I don't have any cool PowerPoint slides to share, but we'll see if we can get through this. So we talk a lot about performance, but we rarely ever define it. We say, hey, it's human performance, it's this, it's that. But what is it? So I'll give you an equation that I like to use to define performance. Performance is simply motivation times ability. That's as quick and easy as I can break it down. If you have a lot of ability, but you're not motivated, your performance is going to suffer. If you're really motivated, but you don't have much ability, you may not get to where you need to be, but they can offset each other. Individual differences impact both of those. On the motivation side, individual differences, environment. On the ability side, training, raw talent, etc. Going back to Janelle's mindset discussion, or mindfulness, how does that play? And if you remember her circle, in that circle, she had grit. And so, and we didn't coordinate this, but I saw grit in her diagram there. But I would argue that grit's highly correlated with motivation. And so I was at a talk several years ago, and a colleague brought up that he defined grit as mindfulness plus love. And of course, I immediately thought about that and said, okay, he's clearly not very good at math, because it's not mindfulness plus love, it's mindfulness times love, because it's a function. But we could get into the weeds on that. I would break it down a little bit further and maybe say our grit is self-regulations times self-awareness times love. Now you're probably thinking, holy cow, here's a Green Beret, barrel-chested freedom fighter talking about love. What the hell is happening? Dogs and cats sleeping together, right? And that's where it gets difficult sometimes in the military environment, is when we start talking about mindfulness. The word itself sometimes has a negative connotation to it, just because it's not tough, right? So trying to get around that through other words, or just working with the military folks sometimes is a struggle. But in either case, if we go back to mindfulness times love is very important, because you're self-aware and you can self-regulate. Because you can self-regulate, but you don't know what you're regulating, then you got a self-awareness problem. Or you can be self-aware, and you're pissed off, but you can't regulate that. Now you're going to have a problem. But the love works both ways, and I think we can tie that into some of the other speakers, and we'll do that kind of as we go. But you got to not only love what you're doing. There are going to be times in your life that you need some love back, and that's where these communities and things come into play. That's where teamwork comes into play. That's where reaching out. So it's not all about, hey, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. We can think about this and say, okay, how do we package this up for rugby players, military, gamers, whoever, to meet them where they are as far as their current mindset. But at the end of the day, love is important. So building on that, Janelle also had talked about thoughts leading to emotions, and emotions leading to behaviors. The only thing I would add in there, and that's based on the research I did for my PhD, is thoughts do lead to emotions and your effects with an A. But those emotions also drive your attitudes, and your attitudes drive those behaviors. And the takeaway message that I would like to offer today for you guys is attitudes do matter. So so since thoughts precede that, your thoughts do matter. But you have a choice. People have a choice as to what they're going to think. They have a choice as to what their attitude's going to be. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the acronym VUCA. JD, it was actually a Air Force researcher or professor out at the Air Force Academy, I think, that came up with the acronym VUCA: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the term's been thrown around in the business world now and in the military. Unfortunately, it's came down to it being used as an acronym, even just, hey, it's a VUCA environment. It's VUCA out there. But I took a look at it and said, okay, VUCA, what is it potentially missing? And I realized it's also missing hostility. So I defined hostility to be resource constraints, time constraints, competition, can be those things in a nutshell. And then so what I did was I just took VUCA and added the H, rearranged the acronym, and it spells havoc. So, flippantly, I guess that's a cooler acronym than VUCA, I think, because that kind of describes the environments that we all face, whether you're in a military or in the business world or a gamer. It's havoc. The world's kind of a crazy place. So, but what I found was studying this at the Special Warfare Center and Schools Selection and Assessment Program, I followed 350 candidates through the course, and I found that those attitudes, I had them take a pre-test or I developed a scale to measure their attitudes towards havoc environments, and found that those attitudes did impact their performance. And it also impacted, or didn't necessarily impact, it was correlated with their performance and their perceived stress levels. So attitudes do matter. That's the takeaway. Last point on this performance topic is there's an article out there. It's 16 years old at this point. It's a model, the Sean and Gillespie model of motivated action theory. Sonia brought up a good point earlier about, this toxicity attacking the person. Well, if you look at motivation action theory, it's a goal-oriented model. So up at the very top of that model is your self goals, and those goals have three main goals. We as humans need agency, we need affiliation, and we need esteem. So if you're attacking the person, you're automatically attacking them at that self goal level. So they feel that, they internalize that. Okay. Below that, we have principal goals. And so those first three self goals feed the next four, which is growth, fairness, structure, and social. So when you look at gaming, you can automatically map how gaming can help our veterans, help just people's mental health in general, because they have an affiliation with their team. It helps them feel agency, they're able to do what they want to do. It helps them with their purpose. If that's helping them with their purpose, their esteem, it's giving them that social structure, and growth, they're getting better or whatever. And then below that, you have some other levels, achievement. I will speak on achievement very briefly. On achievement level goals, so you have self, principle, and then achievement. Under achievement, they argue that there's a mastery approach, a performance approach, and a performance avoid. So a mastery approach is that I want to be the best I can be for me. Performance approach is that's more oriented towards achievement, so you can show everybody else how good you are. So you're doing that to kind of show everybody else, whereas mastery is for you. I would argue mastery is kind of where you want to be. And then performance avoid is, I don't want to play, because you don't want anybody else to see you do bad. And then below that, you have action goals, and that can be anything from feedback to impression management to how you allocate your resources, etc. All right, so that kind of wraps up performance. Right, wrong, or indifferent. That's what I've got on that. Moving on to survival. I'll tie it back to what I just said. We need affiliation in our lives. So we're all going to experience something in our lives that we feel like we survived. Some of us have different levels of survival, something we've survived. But we also need, that agency, to be able to go do what we need to do in the esteem. And one of the things that happens in there for survival is love. If you go back and do case studies of people in POW camps and different things, they had hope, they had love, they loved their families, they had something that was feeding that desire to survive. And then, I kind of have it on the next page, but I'll go ahead and mention it now. Everybody has their level of struggle, but it's their level. So, it's not something we should be judging. So real quickly, we just had a survivals panel, but just to share very quickly, I know a little bit about survival. I just mentioned that, my first talk with JD and Josh and Kevin was coming out of a mental health clinic. And if you had asked me 10, 15 years ago, I wouldn't have said anything about that, right? And so there's grief there just because I was a hypocrite. Whenever I was a commander, I meant it. Hey, if you need help, go seek it. But I didn't seek it myself. So in 2004, I had a few different incidents in Iraq. So I'll hit on two very briefly, and I won't tell the whole story because for time reasons. But the first one was I had a soldier that we were in Baghdad. I was on an ODA, Operational Detachment Alpha. So the show A-Team, that's what it's based on. So I had half my team in one location in Baghdad, the other half in another. One of my guys and another soldier decided they needed to go up north to grab some stuff from the other team house and come back. And it was at night. And at the time, it was early on. It was in March or late February, March of 2004. At that time, it was a pretty stable Iraq. So I told them, I said, no, you got to come back down here tomorrow. Just wait till tomorrow. Well, they convinced me that, hey, no, it's safer at night. Let's just go ahead and get it done. So I gave in. I said, sure, go ahead and go do it. So they were literally going to go get boots for our indigenous force that we were training. So within an hour, excuse me, within an hour of them leaving, I get a phone call as I'm typing up not my op order, but my situation report to hire. I get a phone call saying, hey, sir, you need to come over here. Matt's had an accident. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I guess he backed into something on post or whatever, run over something, messed up the Toyota truck or whatever it was. So I said, okay. So I go up there and I'm like, what's going on? Long story short, my soldier went up north. On the way back down, there was a unit there that was getting ready to redeploy. So all their marking devices and all that had already been put in the Connex. So they threw out a couple chem lights on the road, cordoned off the road because there was a roadside bomb. Well, I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen a chem light, but they're only about 4 or 5 inches long. They don't emit a terrible amount of light. Matt's driving back at 60 miles an hour on a 4-lane highway in a Toyota truck, a civilian truck. And as he drives up, he doesn't see the chem light. And so he drives into the cordon. And so they had to stop him. So all hell broke loose and they opened fire on him. And of course he didn't know that it was green firing on him. So he he accelerated. We had gone to all these driving schools, shooting schools, and all that. Miraculously, he actually drove to the other side of the cordon before he finally hit one of their Humvees. And then he opened the door and they realized they had shot an American. To this day, that, you know, that weighs on me. So he lived. He took a bullet to the head. He took a bullet across his abdomen to his shoulder. So I went to Baghdad, the hospital in the green zone 3 days later. He was just coming to. And the first words he said was, "Sir, you were right." You know, to this day, that's pretty hard to hear. You know, I didn't care about being right. But so I'm just throwing that out there to let you know that, hey, we all have struggles. And we can all get over. Another instance. So guess what? They put me on, you know, to make light of that. They said, hey, we're going to do an investigation. And so we got shut down. Don't go outside the wire. Don't do anything. So that lasted about 2 weeks. The very first day that we could go back on operations, we went back outside the wire. We did operations during the day. We realized that there were some people harassing the local village. So we decided that night that we'd go back in that night and do some reconnaissance to figure out who's doing this in plainclothes, civilian vehicles. So the very first day after that incident, we were out, and you haven't read about this. It's on the secret net. The very first night we went back, myself, my interpreter, and the NCO that was with me got surrounded and we were captured. So we went through an ordeal. It ended up lasting about an hour, but we were captured. We were held hostage. So guns to the head. Literally, I remember thinking there was, you know, a guy that kept coming in through the door with his pistol, with his hand wrapped around the trigger, putting it on my head. And I was just thinking, this SOB is going to kill me on accident. If he's going to do it, just do it. Don't do it on accident. But I remember sitting there like this and telling the interpreter, hey, can you tell these guys to have their guy knock this off so we can get out. So anyways, it's captured. Grace of God, another unit saw that. That's a long story. I could tell that story for a long time because by the end, it was we were surrounded by about 400 people chanting Allah Akbar. They had already shot the windows out of the car with us in the car and throwing bricks and punching us through the car. But a unit happened to be driving by and saw this thing, and they pulled up. They parted ways for the Humvees. And when they did that, I said, okay, this is our time to go. And we kicked the door open and threw people out of the way and dove in. And they were like, what the hell are you guys doing here? And so we drove off. So I'll cut that story there. But that has some long-lasting effects as well. So all that being said, what I would pull from training on these survival things is we mentioned resilience, and that implies bounce back. But I would argue, too, that we can also improve robustness. We need both. And so if we pull from industrial engineering what robustness is, resilience means that you get injured and you can bounce back. Robustness means that you can get punched and you can kind of keep going. So if you look at a conveyor belt in a factory, it goes down, you can fix it quickly. Robustness would be two conveyor belts. One goes down and you keep going. It doesn't mean that you're completely healthy, but it means you can absorb a little bit more. But we got to give the guys and the gals the tools to do that. So, all right. That just said my microphone appears to be noisy. I don't know what that means. It should, because I'm talking. So the clinical topic. We shouldn't say I can't. I teach my kids even. I don't say I can't. I'm currently struggling with. And so just like going to physical therapy is not shameful, and neither should mental or moral injuries be shameful to go get help for. David, you brought up a good point earlier, saying you're grateful to struggle, to have that struggle. We have a saying for that as well. Embrace the suck. So, diamonds are made under pressure, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying you got to keep, you can't keep a knife in the forge full time. You got to bring it out, but difficulties can make us better. So, and then, like I've already said this, people, they own their struggle. You don't know what they went through. Don't judge. I would also argue that, and I don't think I would get much pushback here, but being vulnerable is brave. So listen to Sonia, David share their stories. That's extremely brave. That's hard to do. And then struggle. What I've seen, people that struggle and finally come to grips with it, it's probably the biggest piece of humble pie you can get, right? So it really helps you humble, and it helps you with perspective. Once you've struggled and you are self-aware and you realize, wow, that sucked, and you put it in perspective. These are all words we've already used. Being humble is a great thing. So action, and I'll try to start wrapping this up. I think I'm decent on time. So action. Dr. McCauley mentioned, I think she used the word, the human is the system, or human is the weapon system, or something. We at the Special Warfare Center in school, we would always say, hey, the human is the platform. We invest heavily in the military on every weapon system known to man. We pour billions and billions into it. But the most important weapon system in our inventory is the human. So it's the most lethal weapon system we have, and even in the other system, it is the critical part of that system. So, and then something very similar to some of the stuff that Dr. McCauley was working on. We had a program called Performance Integrated Training. So I'll just kind of throw this out there, food for thought, moving forward. As we look at these programs. The program I built there was, we built Performance Integrated Training. And the idea was, the acronym stood for PIT, but what I was trying to get them to see was the students that were going through the course were no different than race cars during a race. Sometimes something happens and they can't get through the course or whatnot, and they just need a little tweak. So they come into the pit. Sometimes they have bigger issues and they have to go behind the wall and go to the garage and get more help. In either case, we have to set them up for a foundation before they even start the course, where we teach them about physiological, cognitive, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. So a lot of times, PC, political correctness, we run from spiritual. And so I say, hey, it's intrapersonal. So, and it was mentioned before. I think David mentioned it. He said he's a Christian. And I would say, hey, look, whenever I was leading that charge there, I was like, hey, look, we're going to call this spiritual. I didn't say religious. I said spiritual. And what I would say was, hey, I don't, and this is where it's important. It's like, hey, the person to teach these things, a lot of times is not going to have a cross on their collar in the military. It may be somebody that's all tattooed up, all gnarly, and maybe dropping a couple F-bombs during it. But the most important thing is to have that discussion. Have that discussion, because what we found was the first day, people are pretty closed off. But once we got them to break out of that and we showed some vulnerability, get them to show some vulnerability, and then we ask them day one, how many people in this room, 100 guys, cares if the guy to the left or right of them graduate the Q course, the qualification course for Special Forces? About 3 hands went up. After about 3 days of training and getting them to talk and build, building a good community. Almost every hand in the room went up when we asked the same question, because they realized that it was more than just themselves. So I'll throw that out there. And then interpersonal, what we have found is with the electronics, with the text generation, if you will, we have a lot of, we have to do a lot of work when we go downrange to talk to other people face to face. And we found that there has been a drop off in performance on that. So we work with those guys to be better at negotiating and those things face to face. But for every, con on that, there's a pro for it. They embrace the technology, but we have to understand how that impacts their interpersonal skills as well. And then values, we hit values real big. And then real quickly, and I'll wrap up, JD, I would say we focus so much on performance to a fault, especially in the military. That's our criterion. We're leaving a crap ton on the table because the other criterion measure that we're not embracing is arousal and stress. And so when you're looking at experts versus novice in these shooting synthetic training or anything like that, we can easily map that out physiologically, figure out how to get them to focus their attention and their breathing and get them where they're shooting and their performance and their stress levels are at the same as these experts. And they don't have to go through the school of hard knocks like I did. So I know I didn't talk a lot on the breathing and some of that stuff, but there's a lot of stuff to unpack here today, and it's so exciting. I would argue that if you can give me a person that's self-aware, can self-regulate, is adaptable, and is capable, I'll take him on my team, he or she. And then the Yerkes-Dodson law that Dr. McCauley discuss, we use that quite a bit to discuss with our students and things there as well to help them out. So JD, I think I probably maybe even went over a couple minutes or whatever, pending everyone's questions.
Yeah, not at all. You didn't go over, Phillip. Thank you just tremendously. You and I talked a little bit earlier in the week about, thinking on the Warrior Gamer Foundation's mission, right? This issue of intergenerational gameplay and how we as veterans can teach young people, right? Sort of in the innocence of youth, where do you think, what are your thoughts about where we begin as it relates to the training for our middle schoolers? I put a little bit in the notes in terms of that sort of belonging and connectedness, right? But if I gave you, not that you want them, Phillip, right? But if I gave you 12 sixth graders,
yeah, I think
in terms of starting sort of with and for them,
I would take, if you give me 12 sixth graders, I would take the framework for the performance integrated training, and I would teach them everything about physiological, cognitive, interpersonal. I do the same thing, intrapersonal. Do the same thing down on their level, because we've known for years, hey, if you work out and you eat right and you sleep right, shit goes pretty good, right? So but then build on their values and some of those other things early on to let them know, hey, here's the functions of the brain. Here's how it works. Hey, when you drink that Red Bull or that Monster drink, and you stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning eating Cheetos, and you wake up at 6, this is what it's doing to you, and so I would take that same type of model, and there's a place for, obviously there's a place for mindfulness in there. When our cognitive coaches at the schoolhouse, they, I just didn't have enough time, but Dr. McCauley talked about the mindfulness training, the one where it's sustained. They didn't have a drop in their attention. They didn't have a drop in their cognitive agility or what, I can't remember the words used. I think that was Dr. Jaw's study on the MBAT, but either way, Dr. Jaw is doing a study at Fort Bragg, extending that research with our folks there at Bragg. So there's so I would put that all that stuff fits within those pillars. But and then if you moved on to junior high or high school, you know, and if you couldn't do it for everybody, I would argue, you know, it would be good in a health class, right? But if you couldn't do it for everyone, at a minimum, put it in a JROTC type thing. But I don't think it needs to be limited to that. I think it needs to be in health and fitness. So because it's so often it's health and fitness. Hey, how many push-ups can you do? I don't give a shit how many push-ups you can do. I need it. Like, let's talk about all this stuff, sleep hygiene, all these things. And I think the kids, it's harder to teach. It's true that it's harder to teach old dog new tricks. You teach this stuff to these new kids now, man, we're cooking. We're cooking with gas because I think they would just eat it up. Because now I've got, you know, I'm trying to teach it, especially if because what the struggles we have is I'm teaching it to the students and they get it pretty good. Well, guess what? When you look at the learning environment, I've got the students, I've got the actual environment in which they're learning, and then I've got the instructors. Okay, so I've got this instructor pool that is come through the school of hard knocks that is saying, I don't need this shit. You know, we don't need this shit. And I'm like, hey, dude, check it out. You let these guys, you just taught ambush all night. They haven't slept in 48 hours. And now you're bringing them back into the classroom and you're trying to teach them how to dissect a flux capacitor. The shit ain't going to stick. You know, it's like, it's okay if that's the learning objective to see what it's like to not sleep for 2 days. But you need to space this stuff out where they can actually learn how to build the flux capacitor later on. So we have more resistance with the cadre, with the older folks, than we do with the younger folks. That's my 2 cents on that, or 5 cents.
Right. $1 million worth, right?
Yeah.
Better, stronger, faster in terms of that.
Yeah.
Want to open it up now. Want to open it up to the audience. If you have any specific questions for Phillip, please fire them into the chat, and we'll be happy to take a few questions from you if there are any.
Thanks for having me, JD. I appreciate the opportunity. You and Josh and Kevin extending the invitation. Very humbled to be with the cast of characters that you put on.
Brother, we appreciate you in terms of everything that you've done and continue to do, and I know will do with Warrior Gamer as we move forward. We're just so grateful and thankful to have you part of our team. So appreciate you and Godspeed moving forward.
Thank you, guys.
All right, take care. Thanks so much. All right, so it's now my honor to introduce Duane France. And Duane is the Director of Veteran Services right now at the Family Care Center and the Executive Director of the Colorado Veterans Health and Wellness Agency. He's also the founder of Headspace and Timing, which is an organization dedicated to changing the way service members, veterans, their families, and communities think and talk about veteran mental health. So Duane is working to reduce the barriers to veterans seeking mental health support by sharing his knowledge and experience with mental health professionals through social media and his platform. So Duane, I'm going to turn it over to you. You're going to give us sort of the model, more of really the public health perspective and approach to brain optimization and suicide prevention. And so, Duane, I'll leave it to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. And in echoing everybody that came before, to be able to say that really grateful that I'm able to join everybody in this great event. Really thinking about how this has been put together. I had the opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. McCauley a couple of years ago on the podcast. And from what I know of her and everyone else, I think it'd be really beneficial just to rewind, because I think there's been stuff that Janelle would just echo what Dr. Hipskin and David and Sonia and Dr. Thomas all said. So the back half of this could really just be everybody coming back saying, yes, absolutely. The way that this has really been integrated together has been really beneficial. I mean, we started off with Dr. McCauley talking about the psychological benefits of the Warrior Gamer mindset. Then Dr. Hipskin talking about the neurological benefits. Really, David and Sonia talking about the personal benefits, and then Dr. Thomas really just giving us the sort of the individual system level, how we can integrate this mindset into our individual system. And then, unbeknownst to, I know that John and the folks there at Warrior Gamer sort of planned this, but I'm really taking a step back and looking at the organizational system level. So I am a licensed professional counselor. I'm a clinical mental health counselor. I spent 22 years in the United States Army. I was not a mental health professional when I was in the Army. Did the grand world tour of the Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the wonderful places. But as I was retiring, I felt as though that the veterans of my generation and the succeeding generation were going to need support the way that perhaps my father's generation, the Vietnam generation, did not. And so that's really where a lot of my focus has been. So I want to talk to you today about really, as John had mentioned, the public health approach specifically to suicide prevention. And we'll talk a little bit about suicide prevention. But a lot of the work that I've done over the last several years has really been looking at how do we address suicide prevention in a different way. And so first, when we're talking about integrating mental health, integrating wellness, suicide prevention, everybody wants to do things about it, right? And really appreciate all the quotes. We had Lao Tzu, we had Sigmund Freud, and now, of course, we have Abraham Lincoln coming in. And this is always one of my favorite quotes of, it would be probably very helpful if I were to actually share the screen so you could see the quote rather than me. Nope, we're going to stop sharing that. I had all data prepared, didn't I? And of course, this is where we're at. Let me see where my slides went again. There we go. Now we're sharing. Everybody, we all are giving each other infinite grace because of COVID. So, again, Abraham Lincoln's quote. Obviously, now you can see what I was talking about. Really, Lincoln here is talking about public sentiment, public desire to do stuff. And his point was, with public sentiment, nothing can fail. But without public sentiment, nothing can succeed. And what I interpret that he's talking about here is really just this ability to have these conversations publicly and collectively, not just individually. And I think that in this particular instance, the Warrior Gamer Foundation is one that really does support some of this public sentiment, people gathering out and having these conversations. And so there are 3 points when I talk about suicide prevention and a little bit more beyond suicide prevention. But there are 3 particular points that I want to get across to people. And first, in a theme I think that has really run through the time that we've had together today, is that genuine connectedness saves lives. That's what saves lives. All of the other, the thousands of suicide prevention efforts and techniques and strategies, and the national strategies, the VA's national collaborative, and all of the different everything can be boiled down to genuine connectedness, and genuine connectedness saves lives. That means individual to individual connectedness, right? So making sure that people are connected to other people. We heard from David and Sonia, and one thing that I was thinking when I heard Sonia about how real the negativity in VR can feel. Conversely, the connectedness is also very, very real. I've had national projects, multi-year projects with people that I consider close friends that I've never met in person. That's sort of the way that we live our lives a lot these days, is this thing of being connected interpersonally. So that's one of the things that gaming can do. Just like any other interest community can do, it can provide a sense of connectedness and purpose. So connecting people to people, connecting individuals to their community. Yes, we can talk about a geographic community, but we can also talk about a community of interest, individuals having the same interests. And so the gaming community, as opposed to the community of where I am here in Colorado Springs, but connecting individuals to the community. So you can have small groups of people that are out on the fringe, but how can we ensure that people are integrated into a community? Connecting individuals to resources, right? So if somebody is in crisis, if somebody needs some support, how do we connect them to resources? And then how can we connect the community to the resources? And this is one thing that I see the Warrior Gamer Foundation is you have gamers, you have service members, you have individuals who may be loosely connected to each other. They're connected to the gaming community, but then how can we connect them to resources if the resources are necessary? That lower line down there, and this is one thing that I've always seen, is veterans don't need a real good reason to avoid therapy. Any reason's a good therapy or a good reason to avoid therapy. But if you can use some modulating effort through art or through some type of shared interest like gaming, then you can easily access some of those resources. Again, Dr. Thomas just talking about his personal situation in recovery and some of the stuff that he saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. I really appreciate that because, again, 5 combat and operational tours, I always say you don't go through that without getting some dents in the fender. And so the military being an inherently dangerous population, but him telling his story, David telling his story, Sonia telling her story. One thing that I appreciate in having been familiar with David's story before, but and I don't think he mentioned it necessarily today, but his father was in the Navy, right? So he's a military brat, so to speak, right? So he is within that military culture. Sonia's a mother of service members. And so not just having the military experience, Sonia experienced her son's deployment in a very different way than he did, just like my mother did in mine. And so really this is a larger military ecosystem, spouses, parents, children, and service members themselves. But being able to communicate, this is our real story, that helps others in this military affiliated community say they sought help, I can seek help. They did, I can do it. So the biggest concept, and it's really encouraging, I had this slide made before we even had the presentations today, but you've heard throughout all of them, is connectedness. Connectedness is what saves lives. So that's the first point that I really try to emphasize. The second point is that suicide is a complex issue that requires a coordinated community response. There is no one single reason why someone dies by suicide. There's no one particular thing that happens. A colleague and a mentor of mine really says that for somebody to get into a suicidal crisis, 16, in not specifically, but a large number of things have to go wrong in people's lives. And so it's a number, the complexity of the issue is really at hand. And then the other point that I really try to make is that every individual and organization has a role to play in preventing service member, veteran, and military family suicide in our community. And when I say that, I talk about geographic community, but also in the gaming community. This is something this isn't JD's responsibility as a mental health professional within the gaming community. It's not my role as a mental health professional. It's not just on the mental health professionals. It's on everyone. Now, a word about suicide. Suicide is a lagging indicator of multiple underlying problems. You heard, again, both David and Sonia talking about their unique stressors in their lives, which got them to the place of depression. Not saying that either of them were very specifically, and they hadn't mentioned it in a suicidal crisis, but in that dark place, in those really dark places, suicide is a lagging indicator of a multitude of underlying problems. And so this framework that I'm about to talk about really addresses those underlying problems. Suicide is not the problem to be solved in our community or in the communities around us. The problem to be solved are the underlying conditions that lead to suicide. So suicide is unfortunately something that we're talking about as an entrance to this conversation. But it's not my goal to stop suicide. It's my goal to help people and help communities live better lives so that suicide is not an option. So as I'm going through this, please think of those 3 points. Now, as John had mentioned, really talking about the public health approach to suicide prevention. And so if we think about the public health approach, we think about things like reducing drunk driving, increasing seatbelt use, addressing obesity, heart disease, smoking cessation. Again, we're here in Colorado. Colorado has taken a public health approach to suicide prevention. Some of my travels have taken me to places like Las Vegas. Maybe it might be the same way in Los Angeles, but Las Vegas and New Orleans, in which smoking cessation doesn't seem to be as big of a thing in those communities as it seems to be here in Colorado. We've taken a public health approach of no smoking indoors, no smoking in public places, really addressing it in a number of different ways. And so, though that kind of concept of a public health approach, but then the question is, how do we take it from a behavior such as intoxicated driving or vehicle use to a behavior like suicide, and especially one that's so complex. And so really this framework, and as I talk about this framework, this is a framework that was developed through the Centers for Disease Control and adapted through partnerships here in Colorado called the Colorado National Collaborative. But the first step is we need to define the problem. What is the problem that we're trying to address? Well, service member and veterans, their military family members are dying by suicide. Well, that's sort of broad. What specifically is the problem? So we really need to understand what the problem is, and not the 22 a day, 20 a day, 17 a day, and those national numbers, but what is the problem in your community? What is happening with military and veteran suicide in your community? So again, for example, I'm located here in El Paso County, just south of Denver. In 2019, we lost 57 veterans, service members and veterans to suicide in 2019. In 2020, we lost 55, and so an additional 55. We anticipated that it would be more, but thankfully or at least it was not an increase, but it was negligibly the same. So here in El Paso County, we are losing at least one service member or veteran to suicide a week. And that's a problem. So that's a problem that we can now wrap our hands around. How do we address that in the 110,000 veterans and 54,000 service members that we have here in our community? So first is to define the problem. Second is to identify risk and protective factors. So what are the risk factors for drunk driving, for example? What are the protective factors against drunk driving? And how can we reduce risk while increasing protective factors? If we think, those of us who may have these experiences from a number of years ago, in the 70s, let's say, designated drivers weren't a thing. The concept of friends don't let friends drive drunk. It became something personal, increased the protective factor of friendship and connectedness that stopped people from driving while intoxicated. Third is to develop and implement strategies. So we have the risk and protective factors. Now, what strategies are we going to develop and actually implement in our community? We ensure the widest dissemination, and then we evaluate and refine. And so this is the public health approach to any kind of public health problem. Again, high cholesterol, heart attack, substance use on college campuses, right? This is really the framework. Now, when we talk about suicide prevention, what we've done, and Dr. Thomas really alluded to this regarding suicide prevention, is we've done a lot of number 3. We've come up with a new program, we've developed a new strategy, and we've implemented it. But one thing that we haven't done as a military and veteran community, and here as a gaming community perhaps, is we haven't done number 2. We haven't identified the risk and protective factors. We haven't developed a framework around which to employ the strategies. And so really what we have is a bunch of silos. And so we can have centers of excellence that also become silos of failure. And so we're addressing these different aspects of the problem instead of developing it or addressing it as a whole. And so that's really what we're doing. And when I say we, there's a group of us here in Colorado. There's 6 counties in Colorado, but also we're implementing this in other communities. And it's part of what's called the Colorado National Collaborative. And this is a federal, state, local partnership through SAMHSA, the Department of Health and Human Services, through American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. So some federal partners, some state partners, and then in communities. And each of the communities is really trying to, and I'm talking about geographic communities, is trying to implement these different aspects, 3 protective factors and 3 risk factors. So really, I want to talk today is how does this framework apply to what the Warrior Gamer Foundation is looking to do, and how the Warrior Gamer Foundation, as the intent is being developed, addresses these 6 different areas. So first, I'm going to talk about the protective factors. So as I'd mentioned, and as has been mentioned, connectedness. Connectedness is key. This is a protective factor. The more connected people are, the more support that David had from his family. He talked about how his father said, "No, son, I'm not going to let you be isolated because that's going to be harmful. We're going to run wires across the neighborhood, and you're going to be able to connect to your people then." Sonia, as she was struggling with her housing support, her friends in the VR reached out and said, "Hey, we noticed that these things are happening." So that connectedness is significant. Next is economic stability. Both, again, David talked about his financial security, how he's working towards that, but then some of Sonia's difficulties related to her housing difficulties. So economic stability, ensuring that individuals have strong economic stability, is a way to keep someone from getting into a crisis. And then finally, education and awareness as a protective factor. The more we know about suicide, the more we know about suicide prevention, the better we are to help others not get into crisis, but also conversely, the less likely we are to get into a place of crisis without first reaching out for help. So these are the protective factors. Then when it comes to reducing risk factors, we have to provide access to appropriate care. Again, when Sonia was having some concerns in her marriage, what did she do? I'm gonna reach out to a marriage counselor. I'm going to repair that aspect of perhaps, or attempt to repair that aspect of my relationship. So access to care. How do we ensure that those in crisis get the appropriate care? Lethal means safety. We have to talk about it. Nationally, over 50% of all suicide deaths are as firearms. All other methods of death are part of that. In the military population, military affiliated population, it's even higher. It's in over 65%. So we really have to have that conversation around lethal means safety. And then finally, postvention. What do we do after someone has experienced a suicide loss, or someone has experienced a significant suicide crisis and attempt but didn't die from that attempt? And so these are really the 6 areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in depth. But this is a framework in which we can address suicide within the military and veteran community, which is where a lot of my conversation is going to be coming from, but really how the Warrior Gamer Foundation can look at how do we implement suicide prevention, not just saying, "Hey, don't die by suicide, let's not," but how do we actually implement a holistic approach to be able to provide some support. Suicide is preventable. We know that it's preventable. Research indicates that it's preventable, that if we get these things in place, then it's less likely that someone's going to die by suicide. It's very, very difficult to predict, however. That's one of the challenges. Many people think we have to predict suicide in order to prevent suicide. So first tell me everybody who's suicidal, and then I'm going to stop them from dying from suicide. That's intervention. That's not prevention. Prevention is, how do we ensure people are connected? How do we ensure they have good economic stability? How do we make sure they have good access to care, that if they're in a crisis, they don't have lethal means, and that if they do experience a suicide loss, that we get them that support. So we need to, and many of the people in the suicidology community are really talking about, let's get away from trying to predict things and get into trying to prevent things by building communities of wellness. Again, every organization has a role to play, whether you're an individual gamer, whether you're a streamer like David, whether you're someone who's really trying to bring together like Sonia, whether you're a neurological clinician like Dr. Hipskind, or somebody that's really trying to train people in wellness like Dr. McCauley. Every organization has a role to play. Normally, I say the person who made me coffee this morning has a role to play, but today, the person was me. But the person who I buy coffee from in the morning, they have a role to play. The people I bought my house from has a role to play. Everybody in the community has a role to play in suicide prevention. It's not some esoteric thing that belongs in the hands of clinicians. It's something that is really, really beneficial that can be learned by anyone and everyone. And then every organization in a given community either meets these needs or has individuals with these needs. And for example, again, I'll talk about my community, but this is typical in all large communities that have an abundance of resources. You scratch the surface of any military and veteran serving organization in El Paso County, and they fit one of these 6 categories. They help people get connected. Team Rubicon, a sense of purpose. Team RWB, let's go run together. The Travis Manion Foundation, let's go support children. The VFWs, the Legions, right? The homeless veterans organizations, the employment organizations. So again, every organization has individuals or serves these needs or has individuals with these needs, but they don't necessarily think about what they're doing from the lens of suicide prevention. And so really what the Warrior Gamer Foundation is providing support for service members and veterans, an opportunity for them to mentor youth in the gaming community, that sense of purpose. What you're doing for the service member and what you're doing for the youth is preventing suicide. It's not in a banner of I'm a suicide prevention organization. You're providing a sense of purpose, connectedness, building a community of wellness, and therefore preventing suicide. So this is a conversation, or excuse me, a quote that came from the former VA Secretary Bob McDonald. So Secretary Bob, as he liked to be called, still does like to be called, but understands that it's not a single solution to prevent suicide. There's not one thing. There's no silver bullet. There's not a single thing that addresses all of these things. And this was something that as some of the legislation was going through last year in 2020 in Congress, is when he was talking about how advancing meaningful policy overall suicide epidemic and not allowing the politics to hinder it. So within this strategy, and I can tell you, like any really good, robust, federally supported state government, there's a lot of different aspects to this framework, and we can get down into the weeds. I'm going to get down to the top of the weeds. I'm definitely not get into this, and really I'm just trying to present this as a framework. So under connectedness, I'm going to talk about peer norm programs and community engagement activities. Economic stability is related to employment, financial, and housing. Education and awareness, community education, medical professional education, and then gatekeeper education. So again, those are the 3 protective factors. With the risk factors, and again, and as I had some great conversations this week, but was talking to John yesterday, I'm going to be talking from my standpoint as a mental health professional supporting military and veteran populations, but consider this how this may be supporting other populations like the youth or even LGBTQ plus or other individuals who may be at higher risk. So how do we improve culturally competent care? How do we reduce barriers to care? And then how do we reduce barriers to care? We used to have a third one that really had kind of fallen off on this. Lethal means safety, we need to talk about firearm storage, medication storage, and then postvention. How do we provide bereavement support to those who have lost someone to suicide? And then how do we provide support for attempt survivors? So this is really, over the next few minutes, going to be talking about this. Feel free to drop in the chat. Really appreciate both John and Phillip, Dr. Thomas, providing some feedback related to this. But feel free to drop in the chat what you might think or how you might think the Warrior Gamer Foundation could access this, or how you might see this playing out. So first, talking about peer norm programs. And so this was something, never say that those of us in the community and our colleagues in the VA cannot collaborate. So my colleague, Juliana Hollows, which also a licensed professional counselor in the Department of Veterans Affairs, she and I wrote a series of articles that were really building on this concept. But the idea of promoting connectedness among individuals within communities through modeling peer norms, community engagement may protect against suicide. Many veterans are afraid to talk about suicidal ideation, and usually it's related to fear of losing something, so loss of freedom or lost control over our own lives. Peer norm programs are those that try to help veterans address those fears, like, I'm not going to think less of you if you feel like you're in a place where you have a suicidal crisis. That can take the shape of a number of different things. So the Veterans Crisis Line, they are trained individuals. They may not always be service members. A number of them are, but even the Colorado Crisis Line, these different organizations, crisis lines are a type of peer norm program. Groups like Objective Zero. Objective Zero is a technology-based platform in which they train ambassadors to be able to help individuals who are experiencing crisis. Organizations like Vets for Warriors is a non-VA. It's a support line. It's not a crisis line. They don't identify themselves as a crisis line. But again, these are peer norm programs that will help veterans say, hey, you're not alone in this. Again, if you're looking at this from the Warrior Gamer Foundation, like Discord chats, John has talked about setting up these safe places, these safe playgrounds, these locations in which people can drop in and say, hey, I'm struggling right now. How can I do that? That is a peer, or how can I address that? That's a peer norm program. And that's one way that Warrior Gamer Foundation can kind of support. Another thing is community engagement activities. Again, really appreciate what Sonia is talking about, is trying to bring people together. She didn't say this, but bringing civility to the gaming community. David, his streaming is a community engagement activity as he's engaging with people on his streams. And so for a lot of veterans, becoming more involved in their community, again, not just geographic community, but community of practice. So the gaming community, veterans experience increases in physical health, reduced stress, decrease in depressive symptoms. Connectedness also has a direct mitigating effect on PTSD. So again, being connected to people is definitely a great way to support. Now you have veteran community activities. Again, the American Legion, the VFW, the New Age VSO, such as the Mission Continues or Team Rubicon, Student Veterans of America. If you're in an educational community, Student Veterans of America is another great way to connect to that. Non-veteran community activities. Again, I really appreciated Dr. Thomas's differentiating between spirituality and religiosity. I have another great conversation or a great presentation about a mentor of mine saying that you can have high religiosity, so connected to a faith community, but low spirituality. You can have high spirituality, but low religiosity. And so that distinction between religion and spiritualism, but being connected to a spiritual or a higher power or some type of community is definitely something that's beneficial. Or just non-veteran community activities. Again, I have, for example, the Beneficial Protective Order of the Elks, or the Kiwanis Club, or a number of different being a member of a local car club, or being a member of a local gaming community. And so engaging in these different, having a community engagement activities, which again is another thing that the Warrior Gamer Foundation can do, is establish community engagement activities that bring people together to be able to join. Moving on to economic stability as a protective factor, economic financial strain, job loss, long periods of unemployment, all of the different ranges of financial stress may increase individuals' risk for suicide, may indirectly increase risk by exacerbating related physical and mental health problems. So one of the things, the research that we know, that not all suicide is as a result of mental illness. It's not because somebody is depressed. It's not because someone is anxious. It's not because of PTSD. It is because of some of that, but it's not all of that. Some of it is because of just all of that stress. I think, again, Sonia said it very well, is what do I do when I don't know what to do? What is my next step when I have no idea what my next step may be? So again, we look at economic stability as how do we engage in these different things. So employment activities, being employed or having something to do, we can even say that broadly, is a significant factor in the psychological well-being of veterans. Again, David, having been on a leave of absence and leaving his insurance company, but he needed to do something. So now he's streaming. Like, that streaming is a full-time job. Like from 9 to 3, you're streaming. That is physically taxing. But here we're looking at a review with veterans with spinal cord injuries. Even though they were physically disabled, those that were employed had greater life satisfaction than those that did not work after an injury. So employment activities, one for financial benefit, but also just for engagement. And of course, we have organizations like Hire Heroes, USA, hiring our heroes out of the Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I see later on that my good friend and colleague, Joe Aldez, and Onward to Opportunity through the Institute of Veterans Military Families out of Syracuse. Onward to Opportunity is a great way to be able to help veterans and veteran family members engage in economic support, employment and economic support. Housing stability, again, and grateful for Sonia sharing her story later on, is ensuring that individuals have a place to live. I've got another colleague that says it's very hard to talk about your inner child if you don't know where you're sleeping tonight, right? So if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we got to secure the base needs, the safety needs, the physiological needs before we can start thinking about the self-actualization. So multiple studies document the fact that homeless veterans, especially older homeless veterans, exhibit increased suicidal behavior, as well as higher rates of psychiatric and substance use when compared to their non-homeless counterparts. Being stably housed is a significant protective factor against. That's one less thing. That's when I said those 16 things that will go wrong. That's one less thing that will go wrong. That if someone is not worried about where they're sleeping tonight. Organizations such as the VA's Help for Homeless Veterans program, the Healthcare for Homeless Veterans program, which provides HUD-VASH vouchers for those economically disadvantaged veterans. This is, again, another program that is really beneficial that's supporting these issues. And then financial security. Again, going back to homeless veterans, but there's an immense level of stress related to financial security. If you're behind on your bills, again, we've been hearing about these challenges of eviction moratoriums, but thinking of veterans who are tenants who, maybe they were laid off, or family members that were lost their job due to COVID. Really challenging situations related to finances over this past year. So how do we help develop financial security, and whether that's financial wellness? So an organization called Psych Armor provides a series of courses on financial wellness, money talks for military youth. So how can the Warrior Gamer Foundation connect with other organizations that are doing these kind of things in providing financial security? Training and education. So education and awareness around suicide prevention. Gatekeeper training and a number of different types of training and education we'll talk about here. First is, how do we as a community, again, geographic community or a community of interest like gaming, how can there be wider conversations around the conversations of suicide prevention? General awareness in a community about suicide and the myths and misconceptions can reduce stigma against seeking help, or even the stigma against discussing suicide. Changing the community culture related to suicide requires frequent discussions within community networks and from community leadership. Now, that can be leadership such as the Warrior Gamer Foundation, or that can be leaders such as David and Sonia, who are talking about their struggles, right? They're using their lived experience as leadership. And again, David saying, like, I'm blessed that I'm sucking today, right? But at least I'm sucking. But being able to talk about how much he's struggling, physical, that he's going through a cold, the physical illness that he's experiencing, but he's demonstrate openness and honestness, and really having that conversation. So things like the Be There campaign from the Department of Veterans Affairs, or Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, right? So again, suicide is not the problem to be solved, but it's the problem that everybody knows about, right? Really, deaths according to drunk driving was a lagging indicator of people getting behind the wheels and drinking, but we had to talk about the deaths, mothers against drunk driving. We had to talk about the people we lost to intoxicated driving before we could talk about the original pieces of it. Medical professional education. This may come as a concern or a surprise for those who are not in the medical community, but especially even mental health professionals, much less mainstream medical professionals, are not really taught in our programs how to address suicidality. Half of those who died by suicide care met with primary care provider within the month of this. So we're talking about medical providers, but also mental health providers. And so programs such as CAMS, the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicide. I know John's going to talk about this later. So how do we ensure that providers are trained in something like CAMS or something like dialectical behavior therapy, which is seen as an evidence-based practice for treating suicide? How do we train counselors, mental health professionals on counseling on the access to lethal means to be able to have the conversations for our clients in crisis? So whether there are, there's John's a gamer. JD doesn't talk about, or he doesn't hide the fact that he's a gamer. So he's a clinical mental health professional who is also a gamer. So there are mental health professionals in the gaming community. I'm more of a solo gamer, not necessarily an online gamer, but that's one of the things that I do to unwind. Currently slogging, and I do mean slogging my way through Assassin's Creed Valhalla right now, because it's so huge, right? But so there are mental health professionals that are in the gaming community, and how are they going to be connected to individuals who may be in crisis and ready to be able to talk about these things? And then finally, gatekeeper education. And this is really, suicide prevention training is not just for us mental health professionals, but it's also for individuals who, like Sonia and David, and people who are part of training on gatekeeper training, who are just part of these chat rooms or these safe spaces. Gatekeeper training is non-clinical but clinically informed awareness and prevention training. Some studies have shown non-clinical VA staff have received gatekeeper training, improved confidence and perceived knowledge, increased support to veterans in crisis. So things like question, persuade, refer, the VA SAVE training here in our community. We're starting to sponsor monthly SAVE training for military and veteran supporting organizations. We just had a training yesterday with about 25 individuals from various different organizations in our community. Applied suicide intervention skills training. So as Warrior Gamer Foundation is building out this framework, how are they incorporating some type of gatekeeper education for individuals who are wanting to get more involved? How do we ensure that David and Sonia, if they haven't already, had some form of suicide prevention training? It's just going to make their efforts better. It's a way to train to enhance their skills. Moving on to reducing risk factor. So if someone, all those three things will keep somebody, hopefully will keep somebody from dying, getting into a suicidal crisis. But once we are in a crisis, how do we ensure that crisis isn't fatal? That's one of the things is, okay, bad things are going to happen. We're getting into a crisis, but how do we stop the crisis from ending in a suicide attempt or death? So again, here, very specifically around military and veteran population, we have to provide culturally competent care. A 2014 study by the RAND Corporation found that less than a quarter of mental health providers who are TRICARE affiliated understood the military affiliated population to an effective level. And we can have a lot of training around what HUA means and what the different ranks are, but we've talked about how meaning and purpose. How do we find meaning and purpose in post-military life? How do we get rid of the extrinsic examples of military culture, such as a uniform and standing in the rain for no reason and starving ourselves and not sleeping for 20 to 48 hours? But we have those intrinsic characteristics, such as mentorship and a dedication to our group, and just the military mindset. Those intrinsic characteristics still continue. And how do we ensure that providers who are working with those can really understand that? Again, Psych Armor is a good resource for this. They have some courses. I myself have provided a series of webinars for addiction treatment in military and veteran culture through the National Association of Drug Abuse Counselors. And so how do we ensure that those that are providing care for the military population understand the military population? You don't have to be a veteran like me or Dr. Thomas or Dr. McCauley, but you have to understand that. And how does that apply to the gamer culture, right? So you don't want to be somebody who is a very strong gamer and somebody who For example, again, really appreciate David and Sonia. I keep going back to the well on this. But Sonia, who found solace in some of her difficulties through gaming, could you imagine if she went to a clinician that was not supportive and said, well, you're just wasting your time. Don't you know that kills brain cells? Don't you know? Somebody who isn't familiar with the gaming culture, someone who isn't aware of the fact that it really is a connected community, mutually supportive community, often stronger bonds in that relationship than in the quote unquote physical world. And so how can we apply culturally competent care to the gaming culture as I do talk about here in the military culture? We need to reduce barriers to care. If a member of the military affiliate population is willing to seek care, the mental health provider community must ensure that the barriers are reduced. Things like the lack of ability to pay for services, a TRICARE copay. If somebody has TRICARE, for example, it's a $30 copay for specialty services. And so, yeah, if I'm going to the dentist and pay a $30 copay, okay, no big deal. But if I and my spouse and my children are all going to see a therapist, a couples counselor, individual counseling, family counseling once a week for a month, that adds up. So that's a financial strain. Veterans with bad paper, again, that's another barrier to care. Another, for example, non-activated Guard and Reserve component service members don't have access to the same kind of thing. So if we talk about somebody who wants to get care, how do we ensure that they have the access to that care? Things like the Defense Health Agency, TRICARE, VA, or other community services, other ways to be able to support that. Moving on to safe firearm storage. Case managers and community support personnel often fail to address the ability of clients to engage in self-harm. This includes the avoidance of talking about lethal means safety and prescription medication storage. Now, in the military and veteran community, this is a sensitive subject. This is a very private subject. I've had veterans say that somebody asking me about my firearm usage is something that's as personal as talking about how I discipline my children or what happens in the bedroom behind closed doors between me and my spouse, right? Many veterans find this a very personal thing to talk about. Now, very clearly, we're not saying that veterans and service members shouldn't have guns, and we're not talking about violating anyone's rights. We're saying that if someone is in crisis, how do we ensure that that crisis isn't fatal by ensuring that there's safety? Just like when I drive, in case I get into an accident, the accident isn't fatal because I use my seatbelt. It's talking about service member and veterans making their own personal choices about safety, them and those around them, around this very personal choice, because I've had a couple of different presentations over the last several days, and I don't think it was brought up earlier, but suicide is such an impulsive decision. Probably about 60 to 65% of the intent to action is within 2 to 3 hours. Probably about a quarter of them is with less than 20 minutes. And so how do we ensure that if there is that impulse that someone is in crisis, that this is one thing that is taken away? We really got to talk about just saying blanket firearms restrictions are likely to do more harm than good. And not all veterans who are firearm owners are equally at risk of firearm violence. So we can't just say things like the extreme risk protection order or the red flag laws. That can be really challenging. That's not something that's again one of those strategies that are being implemented. But is that really, how is this really in a factor of I'm seeing a lot of great conversations. Yes, John, the power of the pause. This is time-based suicide prevention, right? So think about, when you're really struggling sort of to open up the child-proof cap on your medications, right? And how long it takes, just how frustrating it can be. But how do we put a pause? How do we put a break between the intent and the actions? But then, yes, pausing is a left frontal lobe function. I'm looking out of the corner of my eye to the chat here. But when you're in a suicidal crisis, you're not thinking from your frontal lobe. It is all emotion driven in the majority of cases. It's a very emotional, impulsive sort of that lower function, and we're not thinking rationally, we're not thinking cognitively. And again, John points out gaming and mindfulness build the frontal left networks. So increasing the volume in your prefrontal cortex, which is what controls sort of the emotional part. Again, I could go a lot more in depth into the neurological aspects of these kind of things. But I'm sure Dr. Hipskin can go much, much more in depth into the neurological basis of what's happening if somebody's in a crisis. But if we can put a pause, if we can put some time in between somebody's intent and someone's suicidal action. On the other hand, Dr. Thomas Joyner's interpersonal theory of suicide lists the ability to enact lethal self-injury as a risk factor. Service members we're trained to overcome the lack of the normal human lack of desire to enact lethal means, bayonets, blood, red blood. And so we are trained to enact lethal harm to others and self-harm. And so if we think about Joyner's interpersonal theory of suicide, we have the ability to enact lethal harm, self-injury being one of those. And so we have to talk about safe firearm storage. Organizations called Lock to Live, locktolive.org is something really to help someone. It's an online decision-making matrix. But then the National Shooting Sports Foundations and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, in partnership with the Department of Veterans Affairs, has a campaign and a community suicide prevention firearm safety toolkit that's designed for and designed by firearm owners, because the majority of firearm owners don't want their firearm to be used for lethal self-harm. So we have to find partners. And this is an aspect that if Warrior Gamer Foundation isn't talking about some of these things, firearm storage and medication storage, then we need to have that conversation. Related to medication, again, I'm not throwing a lot of statistics. A lot of this is more conceptual. Medication and overdose is the highest number of attempts, but it results in fewer deaths compared to firearms. But a leading method of suicide attempts. So that's why I'm focusing on medication and firearms. Medications, more people try to use medication as an attempt. Fewer people use firearms, but firearms are by far the most lethal. We really need to understand what that is. And so for a lot of service members and veterans, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and thankfully we're getting away from this, but historically, it's been a wide range of medications available. So really being able to talk about how do we get rid of unused and unwanted medications. My father, a Vietnam veteran, passed away in natural causes in 2017. One of the things I had to do is he had a large number of medications from all of his VA experiences that we needed to get rid of, that I had to dispose of, right? So as we're having these conversations around suicide, we need to have conversations around method. And then finally, bereavement support. So engaging service members, veterans, and their families around a suicide loss can promote healing, minimize adverse outcomes for those affected. Postvention. We know about prevention, although many people think prevention is, I want to stop somebody from dying by suicide in the next 48 hours. Just tell me who they are, I'll save their life. That's intervention. That's somebody who's in a crisis that you're stopping from dying by suicide. Prevention, John mentioned it earlier here in the chat, is these social determinants of health. How do we ensure that we have better social determinants of health? That's prevention. Intervention is how do we provide access to care, lethal means safety. Postvention is what happens after somebody dies by suicide or somebody has a suicide attempt. Many veterans, those of us who served, we all have a number. And the number of those are those that we have lost to suicide. The number of fellow service members that I've lost to suicide is 3 times the number of those that I've personally lost in combat. And that number is going to continue to grow throughout my lifetime, hopefully with all of our efforts less and less. We service members and veterans all know someone who has died by suicide. A doctor out of University of South Alabama, Dr. Phillip Smith, had a conversation with him on a previous podcast that I did. And he describes suicide as both common and rare. It's rare in that many of us can go years without experiencing anyone who has died by suicide. It's been a number of years since I have personally experienced a loss of a comrade. And so it happens so infrequently. They say the base rate. So the base rate of suicide happens so infrequently that it's very rare. But it's also common in that everyone has been impacted by suicide. Everyone knows what it's like to lose someone to suicide. I recall my as a 9 or a 10-year-old, the first time I went to a family reunion was as a cousin who died by suicide. And so it's one of these things that how do we support those individuals impacted by suicide? Many people say suicide impacts 6 people. That's a myth that's been clearly debunked. 2019 study said that nearly 135 individuals per death have been impacted. Personally impacted peripherally. Every time I have a client who has experienced a suicide loss, I'm impacted. The need to support those who experience a suicide loss is a critical component to any community approach. So if a close-knit gaming community, for example, has someone who if they lose someone to suicide, how is Warrior Gamer Foundation going to address that? How are they going to support those individuals? And it's not by providing more suicide prevention training, because suicide prevention training this is what you should have done and you didn't do it. That's not helpful. How do we help people process that death? And organizations such as Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors or something, the VA has a program, Uniting for Suicide Postvention. How can the Warrior Gamer Foundation integrate those? And then how do we provide support for attempt survivors? And so, again, thinking about medications being the most widely used method of attempt, that there are likely a lot of people who have attempted suicide that people don't even know about. I have a very good colleague here in Colorado, Stacy Friedenthal, who is a suicide attempt survivor herself, who attempted to overdose. She attempted to overdose. She fell asleep. She woke up the next day feeling very, very physically poorly, but nobody knew that she had attempted suicide. She had the entire plan, had a note on the door, family don't come in. All of this for 25 or so years, she didn't tell people about that suicide attempt. And so how do we support people who have attempted suicide but didn't die by suicide, either very, very publicly or it's widely known or not widely known? And again, here's this list of things that Warrior Gamer Foundation: foster hope, help people find meaning and purpose, preserve dignity, counter stigma, connection, community connectedness, engaging support family and friends, cultural, ethnic, spiritual beliefs and transit. All of the things that we've talked about today is how to support people who have attempted to take their own life. And so, sorry about that, didn't pop up. So one thing that actually has shown a lot of support is Caring Contacts. And so this is a program in which after someone perhaps leaves a hospital or is discharged from the hospital after a non-lethal suicide attempt, that's a program that follows up with them, that just gives them caring support. So this is the framework, and definitely want to wrap this up and be able to answer some conversations, or answer some comments and have some conversations, and we'll invite John or whoever would like to come on and ask some questions about this. But if we're looking at this framework, and I've sprinkled it in and out, but how does the Warrior Gamer Foundation fit in? Well, absolutely 100% improving connectedness. You definitely have a role in providing education and awareness. So anybody who is, if you build a group of quasi-professionals, semi-professionals, peer, whatever, they need to have suicide prevention education. Absolutely have the ability to access, to connect them to care. As I understand, this is what JD has done for much of the gaming community, is connecting to mental health care, and then providing postvention support, supporting each other after there's been a loss in the community by suicide, or if somebody who had been gone for a little bit and hey, you came back and you find out that they had a significant suicide attempt, how do you provide support? So Warrior Gamer Foundation has a role to play in each of these. Now, David was talking about, I mean, you can make money by streaming, right? So there's also perhaps a way to be able to coordinate some different resources around jobs in the gaming industry. How does one get into the gaming industry? How does one, Sonia talking about writing articles for the gaming industry. I have been in the past, and I'll mention this here in a minute, but I don't have as many books as Sonia, but I do have several books out. But I'm a podcaster, right? That's the way. And my wife called it my really expensive hobby, but now it's starting to pay off because I'm developing funding streams out of the podcasting. And then the Warrior Gamer Foundation also absolutely needs to be able to be part of the conversation around lethal means. If someone is dropping into a Discord chat or one of these safe spaces that you're building and they're in crisis, you have to get comfortable around the discussion around lethal means. So the other bookend quote that I like to share is this well-known quote, like Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Now, the one thing that's missing from this is thoughtful, committed citizens with a framework, with a way to conceptualize things. Like, a lot of people can get out there and say, I'm thoughtful, I'm committed, but then you have dozens of people running in different directions. We need to be able to have a framework around which these thoughtful, committed citizens can do their part and change the world. So we've come to the question and answer portion of that, of this. John, I would love to answer any questions you might have. This is my social contact. If you're interested in more of the things that I'm doing, these are some of the books that I put out to reduce stigma and support mental health in military and veteran population, which you can find at veteranmentalhealth.com/books. I'm a very big guy, both in real life and online. So as long as you spell my name correctly, you should be able to find me. Facebook at Veteran Mental Health, LinkedIn, DKL France, Twitter at The Counseling Vet. Drop the E because that's the way Twitter has their handles. But mostly everything can be found at veteranmentalhealth.com. In the upper left-hand corner, I would like to highlight that if you're interested more in military and veteran suicide prevention, I was able to produce a year-long podcast series in partnership with a friend and colleague, Doc Shauna Springer, and Military Times, called Seeking the Military Suicide Solution, which is a limited series podcast talking about addressing a number of these different aspects in the military affiliated population. So I'm going to pause for a breath and a drink of life-giving water. I will turn it over to John for any thoughts, questions, ideas,
Duane,
questions
phenomenal.
from the audience.
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal. I'm just blown away and humbled and honored by your presentation and the perspective that you brought to us today. I want to breathe as well, just to absorb and sort of take that in. I'll put it over to our audience now. If there are any sort of specific questions that you have, I do encourage you to take a look and listen to all of the tremendous materials that Duane has produced over the years, and just looking forward to our next steps forward. So yeah, let's pause sort of in and with that space. And I think, what, I'm going to try to do this. I don't know if the audio is going to work for us, but just in your talk, it sort of reminded me of Eckhart Tolle and sort of his work there. And so let me just lean in as we sort of think about it and exhale for a few moments. This is from Eckhart's Practicing the Power of Now. And he talks about the beginning of freedom. So let's listen, see if the audio works. I don't know. Let's try it.
Freedom is the realization that you are not the thinker. The moment you start watching the thinker, a higher level of consciousness becomes activated. You then begin to realize that there's a vast realm of intelligence beyond thought, that thought is only a tiny aspect of that intelligence. You also realize that all the things that truly matter, beauty, love, creativity, joy, inner peace, arise from beyond the mind. you begin to awaken.
Right. And so the ability to sort of help people connect to that observer, right? Help people to connect to the witness. Different traditions use, sort of different metaphors to describe that, right? And then what's so interesting is within the context of gaming, that's what we do largely, right? We spend our time sort of witnessing, our third person, sort of in perspective, and then to kind of build with mindfulness practices to sort of do that. I think and to do that, like you're saying, Duane, sort of through this thoughtful, mindful framework.
Yes, but also one of the beneficial things in communities of interest here is that shared background knowledge. Some examples that I did in my presentation is the shared background knowledge of the frustration of child-proof caps, right? And you said I hated that, or perhaps those who might be experiencing Assassin's Creed Valhalla right now with its 67 hours of every single mind-numbing piece of thing that you can do, right? And so that was an individual experience of mine, but it's also a common shared background experience that many people are experiencing, right? And so I think that's one of those things that what we observe in the world. I say flowers are beautiful, and you think flowers are beautiful, and maybe the term beauty means different, but as I observe the world, and then we have the shared background knowledge, I have an understanding of how you may observe the world, and I think that's really one of the beneficial things of having some shared background knowledge within the military and veteran community. Again, Dr. Thomas talking about his experience of Iraq 0405, which is very different than when I was there 06, 07, better or worse. But again, shared background knowledge, shared background experience. So as we observe, as we are this observer, the thinker of our thoughts, the thinker of our thoughts are much more common than the thinker of other people's thoughts. And so we have some commonality there. So I really appreciate you bringing that out. Kevin did say, what is one piece of homework that you could give the group to add more support to veterans and their mental health? I think really just you've gotten resources thrown at you today. Janelle's website, Dr. Hipskin's work, David and Sonia's stuff, but just digging into the resources that you're had, right? I mean, if I'm interested. We're here in Colorado, and what's the favorite fall pastime or late summer pastime of Colorado is watching the quarterback controversy in the Broncos game, right? So I'm interested in watching the Broncos game tonight. I have to do the research to figure out how to watch the Broncos game tonight because it's on at like 8:00, and so if I'm interested in that, whether it's Teddy or Drew. I have to figure that out. This is, again, one of the things related to, we always think we have to start at the beginning with these things, but think about comic books and think about the Assassin's Creed franchise, let's say, but think about comic books and think about professional wrestling. When you watch professional wrestling, it never says this is who this is and you have to watch the whole story. No, you're dropped in the middle of the story. You're dropped in the middle of the storyline. You pick up a comic book. And if you want to learn more about what that is, you have to go back and do the research on that. A lot of times when we're trying this military and veteran culture, we all have to start at the beginning of this is what hua means. This is the difference between oorah. This is what this means. No, that's some basic stuff. Let's move beyond these basic conversations. So really the homework is just dig into some of the resources that are out there to learn more about the psychological the mental aspects of servicemen. Just sit down and if you don't know any veterans, have a conversation with veterans. Have a conversation with them about what was it like to be trapped in the back room of some closet for an hour, right? I mean, again, really appreciate Dr. Thomas sharing that. But what was that like for you? What was it like, David, for being the son of a military service member and experiencing what that was? Sonia, what was it like being the mother of a deployed service member. And she even mentioned it very briefly as she mentioned Afghanistan. What is it like for her right now? Just you, John, and me, and Philip, and Janelle. What is it like for us this past week? It's not been a fun week for me, and I know that's not been a fun week for a lot of people. And so it's really trying to understand what is it like, and just doing the research. So hopefully that was beneficial, something you were looking for, Kevin.
Yeah, and let me also, Duane, just to build on that, because that's fantastic. I want to really just invite everyone in these times. There's a wonderful book, The Art of Communicating by Thich Nhat Hanh. And so especially, Duane, I mean, you raised the point right now. This is what I think we want to say, well, even to each other, right? Our brothers and sisters in arms, sort of in terms of that process.
Yeah. Philip just dropped a
I
question.
understand you more. I want to understand your difficulties.
You're playing it again.
I want to listen to you because I want to love you. When we take the time to look more deeply, we may see for the first time the big block of suffering in that person. Someone might pretend not to suffer, but that's not true. When you're able to listen compassionately, other people have a chance to tell you about their difficulties. In any relationship, you may want to check whether you have understood the other person. If it is a relationship that is harmonious, in which communication is good, then happiness is there. If communication and harmony exist, it means mutual understanding is there. Don't wait until the other person has left or is full of anger to ask the important question. Do you think I understand you enough? The other person will tell you if you haven't understood enough. He will know if you're able to listen with compassion. You may say, please tell me, please help me, because I know very well that if I don't understand you, I will make a lot of mistakes. That is the language of love.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what this is understanding people on a more personal level as opposed to a very transactional level of, are you okay? I'm going to get thee to the doctor. One more thing, Philip just dropped in there about love to see this information put in a purposeful program to off-ramp service members into their next mission as a civilian. Yes, this framework is actually being implemented. This framework, one, it's based off of the CDC's technical package to prevent suicide. It's directly in line with the VA's national strategy, the DOD's national strategy to prevent suicide. What these national strategies do is they tell us what needs to be done, but not how to do it. That's the issue. It's up to individual communities on how to implement these things. And it can be challenging because, again, for example, here in El Paso County, Denver, even Tampa, San Diego, large military, there's so many resources that really there needs to be a framework around that, right? So it's an agency of agencies. And so really the program that is being developed here in El Paso County is really everybody that's doing these different aspects. So let's just get everybody that's doing connectedness in the room, all the puppies and ponies and trips to the mountains and place to the lake. Everybody get in a room and talk about how to collaborate, right? Everybody that's doing housing and employment and financial security, you all go over there and you collaborate, right? But it's really more about, it's not so much developing another program, but it's providing a framework in which programs can collaborate. And I think that's really this next step that we need to do, because we're all running around like we each have a piece of the puzzle and we're at a puzzle convention and we're trying to find the other person that has a puzzle piece that matches to ours. But we want to make sure that but then we only hang around with people with the same kind of puzzle piece. We really need to be able to have somebody that says, okay, everybody put your puzzle pieces on the table. Let's figure out how they all connect. So definitely agree, Dr. Thomas, that idea of we indoctrinate ourselves into them, or we get indoctrinated in the military, but we don't do a very good job indoctrinating, so to speak, into civilian life. And this is really more of a framework in which organizations can collaborate rather than a program itself.
Right. And that's a fantastic point, Duane. And I want to introduce now the person that's going to really help us sort of check out our puzzle pieces and put it together. He's quickly becoming a very dear friend of mine. He's the chair of our community development. Ian Mills. Ian, if you sort of jump on cam and lead us in the afternoon as we sort of take us to the action steps, and nothing better than a Marine to sort of take us forward from there. So, leave it to you.